It was one of those Friday nights where the city seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Rain tapped gently against the windows of the bar, creating a soothing rhythm that blended with the low hum of conversation and the soft jazz playing in the background. I hadn't planned on going out that night, but after a particularly grueling week at work, I found myself drawn to the familiar comfort of the Rusty Nail, a small, intimate bar tucked away on a side street that most people walked past without noticing. There was something about the warm amber lighting, the rich mahogany of the bar top worn smooth by thousands of elbows, and the smell of whiskey and lemon that always made me feel at home. I pushed through the heavy door, shaking raindrops from my jacket as the warmth of the room enveloped me. The bar was busier than usual, with nearly every seat taken. My eyes scanned the room, searching for a place to settle, when I noticed there was just one barstool left at the far end. As I made my way toward it, I noticed him at the same moment he saw me. Our eyes met briefly across the room, and something in his gaze held mine for just a second longer than a casual glance. He was sitting on the second-to-last stool, meaning whoever took that final seat would be sitting right beside him. I hesitated for just a moment, then continued forward. As I slid onto the last bar stool, I was immediately aware of how close we were sitting. The bar was crowded enough that our knees brushed against each other as I settled in. I mumbled a quick sorry about that, but made no real effort to adjust my position. Neither did he. His knee stayed pressed lightly against mine, a point of warmth and connection that seemed somehow significant in a way I couldn't quite articulate. He was striking in an understated way, not conventionally handsome perhaps, but there was something magnetic about him. Dark hair that fell just slightly into his eyes, which were a deep brown that caught the light when he smiled. And he did smile, a small one that lifted just one corner of his mouth, as he nodded in acknowledgement of our shared space. He wore a simple navy blue sweater that looked soft to the touch, and his hands wrapped around a glass of what appeared to be whiskey, neat. There was a quiet confidence in the way he held himself, relaxed yet present, as if he was completely comfortable in his own skin. "Last seat in the house," he said, his voice deeper than I expected, with a slight rasp that made me want to hear more of it. "Lucky you got here when you did." I nodded, feeling a strange flutter of nervousness. "Yeah, busier than usual tonight." Small talk, the universal language of strangers in bars. Yet something about this felt different. The bartender came over, and I ordered a bourbon on the rocks, my usual. "Good choice," my barstool neighbor commented. "I'm a Macallan man myself." He raised his glass slightly, the amber liquid catching the light. "Can't go wrong with a classic," I replied, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded despite the inexplicable tension I felt building between us. Our knees were still touching, and neither of us had moved away. It felt like a silent agreement, an acknowledgement of something neither of us was ready to name. The bartender returned with my drink, and I took a grateful sip, feeling the familiar burn as it went down. The stranger and I fell into conversation about whiskeys, which led surprisingly easily into talking about music when the bar's playlist shifted to a Tom Waits song that we both recognized. His face lit up as he talked about seeing Waits live years ago, and I found myself leaning in closer to hear him over the growing noise of the bar. "That's the thing about great music," he was saying, gesturing with his glass. "It's like it reaches inside you and touches something you didn't even know was there." His knee pressed a little more firmly against mine as he shifted in his seat, and I felt a jolt of awareness run through me. "Exactly," I agreed, perhaps too enthusiastically. "It's the same with any art that really connects, isn't it? Books, films, they make you feel less alone somehow." I wasn't usually this forthcoming with strangers, but something about him made me want to share these thoughts. He laughed then, a genuine sound that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "And here I thought we were just going to talk about the weather and sports." His smile was warm, inviting me to share in his amusement. "I'm Daniel, by the way." "Alex," I replied, offering my hand without thinking. When he took it, his grip was firm and warm, and he held on just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. That brief handshake felt more intimate than it had any right to. Our conversation flowed easily after that, moving from music to books to travel. He told me about his backpacking trip through Eastern Europe after college, painting vivid pictures of cobblestone streets in Prague and sunrise over Budapest. I shared stories about my time living in Seattle, the endless rainy days, and the way the city came alive in those rare moments of sunshine. We discovered a shared love of hole-in-the-wall restaurants and obscure films, each revelation feeling like uncovering a small treasure. You know what's strange? Daniel said after we'd been talking for what must have been an hour, though it felt like minutes. I almost didn't come out tonight. Had a terrible day at work and was just going to order takeout and watch something mindless on Netflix. What made you change your mind? I asked, genuinely curious. He took a sip of his drink, considering. Something just told me I should. One of those gut feelings, you know? Like if I stayed home, I'd be missing something important. His eyes met mine, and there was a question in them, or perhaps an answer. I felt a rush of something like vertigo, a dizzying sense that this moment mattered more than I could understand. I know exactly what you mean, I said quietly. I had the same feeling. The bar had grown even more crowded, people pressing in around us, but somehow it felt like we were in our own bubble. The noise seemed to fade into the background, and all I was aware of was Daniel's knee against mine, the way his fingers traced patterns on the condensation of his glass, and how his eyes kept finding mine even when we were looking elsewhere. As our conversation deepened, Daniel mentioned his recent promotion at the architectural firm where he worked. It should be exciting, he said, but honestly, it's terrifying. More responsibility, more chances to mess up spectacularly. There was a vulnerability in his admission that touched me. I get that, I said. Success can be scarier than failure sometimes. At least with failure, the worst has already happened. He looked at me with surprise, as if I'd articulated something he'd felt but never put into words. Exactly. And there's this constant feeling that I'm just pretending to know what I'm doing, and eventually everyone's going to figure out I'm making it up as I go. The infamous imposter syndrome, I nodded. I feel that every day in my job. I hadn't planned to share my own insecurities, but his honesty invited mine. I'm a graphic designer, and every time I present a concept to a client, there's this voice in my head saying they're going to hate it and realize I have no idea what I'm doing. Daniel leaned in closer, our shoulders now touching as well as our knees. But do you have any idea what you're doing, I mean? I laughed. Some days, yes. Some days, definitely not. But I'm passionate about it, even when it terrifies me. That's all any of us can hope for, isn't it? He said softly. Finding something worth being terrified about. The way he looked at me as he said it made me wonder if he was still talking about work. I felt a warmth spreading through me that had nothing to do with the bourbon. The night progressed, and we ordered another round of drinks. Our conversation took turns I couldn't have anticipated, moving from lighthearted banter to surprisingly deep territory. Daniel told me about his father's battle with Parkinson's disease and how it had changed his perspective on time and what matters in life. I found myself sharing the story of my sister's struggle with addiction and my complicated feelings of helplessness and hope. These weren't things I usually discussed with anyone, let alone someone I'd just met. But there was something about Daniel that made the words flow easily. I'm sorry, he said at one point, looking slightly embarrassed. I don't usually dump my life story on strangers in bars. I don't think we're strangers anymore, I replied, surprising myself with my boldness. And I don't mind. It's nice, actually, to talk like this. His smile in response was soft and genuine. It is, isn't it? Refreshing to skip all the surface-level stuff. As we talked, I became increasingly aware of every point of contact between us. Our knees still pressed together, our shoulders occasionally brushing, his fingers sometimes coming close to mine on the bar top, but never quite touching. There was an electricity in those near touches that was more intoxicating than the alcohol. The bar had started to thin out a bit, the hour growing late. The music had shifted to something slower, more intimate. In the slightly emptier space, we could have moved apart, given each other more room. Neither of us did. Can I ask you something? Daniel said, his voice lower now. And feel free to tell me if I'm completely off base here. My heart rate picked up. Sure, I managed to say, though my mouth had suddenly gone dry. He took a breath, looking down at his glass before meeting my eyes again. I'm feeling something here, between us, and I'm wondering if you feel it too, or if I'm just imagining things. The moment hung between us, fragile and full of possibility. I could have laughed it off, could have created distance, could have protected myself from the vulnerability of acknowledgement. Instead, I found myself nodding slowly. You're not imagining it, I said quietly. I feel it too. Something shifted in his expression, relief, perhaps, or anticipation. I haven't felt this kind of connection with someone in. I can't even remember how long. he admitted. It's a little scary, I said, giving voice to the anxiety that had been humming beneath the surface of our interaction. Terrifying, he agreed with a small smile. But worth it, I think. He hesitated, then slowly, deliberately placed his hand on the bar, palm up, an invitation. I looked at his hand, then back up to his eyes. In them, I saw the same mixture of hope and fear that I was feeling. Slowly, I placed my hand in his. His fingers closed around mine, warm and solid. That simple touch felt more significant than any kiss I'd ever had. The world around us seemed to recede even further. The music, the remaining patrons, the bartenders moving behind the counter. All of it became background noise to the thundering of my heart and the warmth of Daniel's hand holding mine. I don't usually do this, I said softly. Meet someone and feel, whatever this is, so quickly. Neither do I, he assured me. But maybe that's what makes it special. It's unexpected. We sat like that for a while, talking more quietly now, our hands still joined on the bar top. He told me about his childhood dream of becoming a pilot, about the small apartment he shared with his cat named Fitzgerald, about his favorite spot in the city, a bench in a hidden corner of the botanical gardens where he went to think. I told him about my collection of vintage cameras, about the novel I'd been trying to write for years, about how I still called my grandmother every Sunday without fail. Each revelation felt like a gift, a piece of ourselves we were choosing to share. The bar was closing soon, the bartender calling last orders. We'd been sitting there for hours, though it felt like no time at all. The inevitable question of what happened next hung in the air between us. I don't want this night to end, Daniel said finally, giving voice to what I was feeling. Me neither, I admitted. The thought of saying goodbye and walking out into the night alone felt wrong somehow, as if we'd be interrupting something important before it had fully formed. He took a deep breath, then asked, "Would you want to go somewhere else? There's an all-night diner a couple blocks from here. Their coffee is terrible, but they make great pancakes." The offer was innocent enough, just a continuation of our conversation in a new location, but we both knew it was more than that. It was a choice to extend this connection, to see where it might lead. "I'd like that," I said, and the smile that spread across his face made something in my chest tighten. We settled our tabs, and as we stood to leave, the physical connection of our knees was broken for the first time in hours. I felt its absence immediately, a small but noticeable void. But as we made our way to the door, Daniel's hand found the small of my back, guiding me gently through the remaining patrons. That light touch felt both protective and possessive in a way that sent a shiver up my spine. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the streetlights. The night air was cool and fresh after the warmth of the bar. We stood for a moment on the sidewalk, suddenly shy again in this new context. "It's this way," Daniel said, gesturing down the street. As we began walking, our hands brushed against each other once, twice, before his fingers tentatively entwined with mine. The simple act of walking hand in hand through the quiet streets felt both ordinary and extraordinary. The diner was exactly as he'd described, slightly shabby, brightly lit, and nearly empty at this late hour. We slid into a booth by the window, sitting across from each other for the first time. Without the press of his knee against mine, I felt strangely bereft, but there was something new and exciting about being able to see his face fully, to watch his expressions without having to turn my head. We ordered coffee and pancakes as promised, and as we waited, Daniel reached across the table and took my hand again, as if he couldn't bear not touching me now that he'd started. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "if either of us had arrived at that bar 5 minutes later, someone else would have taken that last seat. We might never have met." The thought was sobering. Or if one of us had decided to stay home after all, I added. "Exactly." His thumb traced circles on the back of my hand. "It makes you wonder how many connections we miss every day by the smallest margins." "But we didn't miss this one," I said softly. His eyes met mine, warm and full of possibility. "No, we didn't. And I'm very glad about that." The pancakes arrived, steaming and golden. We ate and continued talking, our conversation flowing as easily as it had at the bar, but with a new layer of acknowledged attraction underlying every word. We shared bites of food from each other's plates, laughed at the terrible coffee, and let our feet tangle together under the table. As the night deepened toward morning, we exchanged phone numbers, both of us acknowledging without saying it directly that this was just the beginning of something. When we finally left the diner, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Standing on the sidewalk again, facing each other, there was a moment of hesitation. We'd shared so much in the span of one night. Thoughts, feelings, stories, touches, but not a kiss. It felt both inevitable and momentous. Daniel stepped closer, his hand coming up to gently touch my cheek. "I want to see you again," he said, his voice low and certain. "You will, I promised." And then, because it felt right, I leaned in and kissed him. His lips were soft and tasted faintly of maple syrup and coffee. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The street, the approaching dawn, the world beyond us. There was only this connection, this person who had been a stranger just hours ago and now felt impossibly important. When we finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Daniel rested his forehead against mine. "Best barstool I've ever shared," he murmured, and I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in months. We parted ways reluctantly, with plans to meet the following evening. As I walked home in the early morning light, I thought about how differently my night had turned out than I'd expected. I'd gone to the bar seeking solace in the familiar, and instead found someone, entirely new. I thought about that last barstool, and how Daniel's knee had stayed pressed against mine, neither of us moving away. How that small point of contact had been the beginning of something that now felt vast and full of potential. How sometimes, the most meaningful connections start in the simplest ways: a shared space, a conversation, a touch. As I reached my apartment building, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Daniel. "Made it home safe. Already counting the hours until tomorrow. Thank you for taking that last barstool." I smiled as I typed my reply. "Thank you for not moving your knee." Sometimes, the smallest moments can change everything. A decision to go out instead of staying in. The timing that puts you in a specific place at a specific time. A knee pressed against yours that you choose not to move away from. And in those small moments, whole new worlds of possibility can open up, if only we're brave enough to notice them, to acknowledge them, to see where they might lead. As I fell into bed, exhausted but exhilarated, I knew that whatever happened next with Daniel, I would always remember this night. The night when taking the last barstool led to something I hadn't even known I was looking for. Something that felt, even in its newness, remarkably like coming home. Total _char_count, 18,603.